The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
On Monday, I told you about the Turkish prime minister admitting that he personally gave the order for Turkey to shoot down a Russian plane which had gone over, which was in Turkish airspace for 17 seconds. And we sort of speculated that this may be connected to Turkey's desire to drive a wedge between Russia and the West, where tensions have been noticeably not very significant since the terrorist incident in Paris. And we now have more information which suggests that our speculation, and that of many others, Lewis, I mean, it was not just us speculating, may have been absolutely spot on. Russia is now aiding Kurdish rebels, a group that has been labeled as terrorists by Turkey. In layman's terms, this is an alliance which, to Turkey's geopolitical aspirations, particularly in Syria, could be very, very bad. Turkey is now in a situation where the legendary Syria-Turkey ISIS oil train is being destroyed by Russian bombers. And we are increasingly, Lewis, seeing what is shaping up. And I don't know what I would predict would even happen here. This is really shaping up to be interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, because of how it's going to influence Turkey and ISIS and that connection, which I'll get to a little more, but also because of the way in which it may change the dynamic of Russia-Western relations.
Yeah, I don't think it's reasonable to expect there to be some type of war. I think both countries are going to avoid that at all costs. But Syria, the Syrian battlefield could become a lot more bloody as a result of these tensions increasing.
And in addition to this alliance that we are now seeing, at the Paris Climate Summit, Vladimir Putin, and I understand we have to take everything Vladimir Putin says with a grain of salt, Vladimir Putin said that Russia has evidence that Turkey shot down that Russian plane in order to, quote, ensure oil deliveries by ISIS. We can't believe everything that Vladimir Putin says, but what's clear is that the rift is ramping up. If indeed it is true that there is this connection between either Erdogan, the Turkish president, or others in Turkey, and ISIS's, that's a tough word to say, ISIS's illegal oil trade, and that Erdogan, as some are saying, personally benefited from it, that would be huge. And it also wouldn't be all that shocking, given what we've learned about Erdogan over the last couple of years.
Well, I think that I would kind of be surprised by that. I don't really see Erdogan or Turkey in general needing to get involved in that type of thing at all.
Want, I don't know.
I mean, that dude's got money. Didn't we talk about that crazy palace he had built or something? I mean, I think he's all set. I think the country is relatively stable and doing okay. I mean, I don't see a reason for them to get involved with that. And of course, Putin is going to say things like that.
Well, it's not just Putin, right? I mean, Russia's deputy defense minister, who of course is just a mouthpiece for Vladimir Putin, Anatoly Antonov, told journalists in Moscow that, quote, Turkey is the main destination for the oil stolen from its legitimate owners, who are Syria and Iraq. Turkey resells this oil. The appalling part of it is that the country's top political leadership is involved in the illegal business, President Erdogan and his family. Very serious accusations. I'm going to wait until we hear it from more than just Putin and one of his people before I say this is probably true.
Yeah, you said you wouldn't put it past the guy. I don't really know. But certainly if we were to discover that this is the truth, that would be huge.
Absolutely huge. Truly, truly incredible. Continuing our discussion of foreign policy and of the Middle East and of ISIS, we've seen Republican presidential candidates for 2016 use basically every bit of ideological gymnastics to somehow blame President Obama for the rise of ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, call them what you want. Reasonable people understand that ISIS was not created by President Obama, but rather surfaced, grew, flowered in the vacuum that resulted from George W. Bush's harebrained invasion of Iraq based on faulty intelligence presented to many people by Colin Powell, who knew that some of what he was presenting was not a very strong case. The former commander of U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, his name's Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, He said something stunning in an interview with the German newspaper Der Spiegel. He said that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was in custody in an American military prison in 2004 and was released because he was deemed harmless. Take a look at this quote from this interview. Quote from the Lieutenant General. "We were too dumb. We didn't understand who we had there at the moment. When 9/11 occurred, all the emotions took over, and our response was, where did those bastards come from? Let's go kill them. Let's go get them. Instead of asking why they attacked us, we asked where they came from. Then we strategically marked in the wrong direction." If it was revealed that a former Democratic president had a terror leader in a prison and released him, it would be hugely damaging. It would be 24/7 coverage on Fox, on Rush Limbaugh. It would be apoplexy and hysteria. It was Bush, though, the guy Republicans sort of pretend never existed to the extent they are faced with the reality that he was president at all. This would only be a bombshell in a country that cared about facts and the truth above all else. That's not really our country right now, is it?
Well, yeah, you could argue it hasn't been for some time, since, I guess, right before the war. This really isn't surprising to me. I mean, our intelligence was just so shoddy, and maybe it still is. You don't really know who you have. You don't know who you're dealing with, and maybe at the time he was harmless. Maybe at the time he might not have been a big shot at all. I don't think it's too difficult to rise through the ranks in an organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or what have you.
You're making a fair point, which is maybe there was really no specific reason to think that this guy was going to become the leader of ISIS. Fine, I grant you that. We indefinitely detain people for nothing, right? So, we still let this guy go. That's the incredible contrast that I'm seeing. And as far as the impact of this on right-wingers, you might as well tell right-wingers that George W. Bush spontaneously combusted and flew off to heaven, and it would have the same impact as saying Bush released the future leader of ISIS from prison. I think it is just at this point, you're not really going to make an impact because Obama is bad.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to look at it. Now, what I think is interesting about this guy is if he was not released, maybe there'd be a different leader of ISIS.
Probably.
Maybe this is the guy who messes up and eventually creates some type of situation which, gives us an edge, or he messes up and it's the beginning of ISIS's downfall.
So maybe we'll be better off that it's this guy who's in charge of ISIS than someone much smarter. I mean, Lewis really digging deep here to find the silver lining.
Yeah. Well, not much of a silver lining, but yes, certainly we imprisoned American citizens for years who have no connections to terrorism at all. And then we have this guy, and off you go, harmless.
Now, on this program, we are different than some other so-called liberal shows. We use the term Islamic terror. Some don't. Islamic terror is a thing. We discuss the realities that, for example, according to a Pew Forum study from a couple years ago, out of the 1.62 billion Muslims that are on Earth, or were at the time, 748 million at the time of the survey believe that the death penalty is an appropriate punishment for adultery. That's extreme, that's disturbing, and I have no qualms whatsoever about telling you that. However, we also know on this program that in the United States, most terrorists are white, American-born men, not foreign Muslims, not people coming in with refugee status from Syria or from whatever other country. Terrorism from Muslims, terrorism perpetrated by Muslims, receives disproportionately more attention in the United States from politicians, from reporters, from corporate media. And the reality is, as we've said before, right-wing extremists pose a much greater threat to people in the U.S. than terrorists connected to ISIS or similar organizations. And I'll remind you about the article in the New York Times. It was a few months ago. UNC professor Charles Kurtzman and Duke professor David Shanzer explained that Islam-inspired terror attacks accounted for 50 fatalities after the 9/11 attacks, while right-wing extremists accounted for 337 attacks per year in the decade after 9/11, causing over 250 fatalities. So two really important takeaways. And remember that part of the goal of terror is to create fear and to create blowback with the security state and to make people live in fear and without privacy, okay? So 2 takeaways here. Number 1, in the United States, you are way more likely to be the victim of white US-born terrorists than Muslim foreign-born terrorists. And it is not very likely at all that you're going to be the victim of a terror attack. That is the key takeaway, Lewis. When we think about what our policies should be, when we think about NSA surveillance, when we think about all of the different reactions that a country can have militarily and intelligence-wise to terror, you have to remember it is so unlikely that you will ever be the victim of a terror attack living in the United States. Doesn't mean we should ignore that risk. Doesn't mean we should say, hey, no more TSA, no more screening of refugees, none of it. Doesn't mean we should say that, but it means that we should not be living in a hyper scary world that we create in our own minds where at any second, any one of us is going to be the victim of a terror attack. It could happen, very, very unlikely.
But we do live in that world. And it's very apparent with all the legislation and everything that happened after the 9/11 attacks.
We live in a world where we have responded with legislation that would suggest that being a victim of terror is a likely thing.
Yes. And so that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the repercussions of that, the NSA, the surveillance, Homeland Security, the airport security, everything, everywhere. And so, in a way, those Islamic terrorist attacks have had a much greater impact.
Absolutely.
Despite not being as frequent as the ones we're talking about here. And so, so we're still victims. I think we're all victims.
Even local law enforcement agencies know the reality of this. Of the 382 agencies that Kurtzman and Schanzer spoke to, 74% said anti-government extremism is one of the top 3 terrorist threats in our jurisdiction. Only 39% said that extremism connected with al-Qaeda or like-minded terrorist organizations is one of the top 3 threats. So local law enforcement that seems to base their opinions on what is actually happening seems connected to reality. It's federally and for political reasons that we've seen what has happened take place.
Right. The climate of fear that has been created. And, it's going to take a long time to get over that. But certainly, Dave, I don't like living in a world full of people who are afraid all the time.
And last thing on this, your chances of being killed in a car accident are so much higher than of being killed in a terrorist attack. And still, people don't wear seatbelts. And those are the same people who want NSA surveillance and all the other stuff that we know has not prevented terrorist attacks. You got to start with the most simple stuff. Wear your seatbelt if you want to reduce the chance of dying an early death.
Or wear your helmet when you're riding your motorcycle.
Sure.
Right? But Dave, it's all about personal freedoms. We can have that debate another time, I suppose.
Freedom and liberty, the freedom not to wear your seatbelt, and the freedom to do a lot of other stuff, apparently. Let's take a break. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. Lewis is on Twitter at lewismotamedy.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show depends on funding from you to keep going, to keep growing, to keep expanding our programming. Today's new member of the day is Justin Sampson. Justin Sampson, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. You can join Justin at davidpakman.com/membership. Get the bonus show, world famous bonus show hosted by producer Louis Motamedi, watched in over 35 countries. Incredible. And if you want a free 2016 Hatriot Mail calendar like this one that is sitting with me every day until we stop offering them, go to davidpakman.com/calendar16 and we'll send you the calendar for free with your yearly membership. If you just want to buy the calendar, you can do it there too. And I know Louis is very, very active. During the breaks, he goes on and orders 10, 20, 30 calendars. It's a whole thing. Okay, Hatriot Mail. What is Hatriot Mail? That's what you need to know first before we go any further.
It's like a mandatory transvaginal ultrasound for your mind. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
So today, Hatriot Mail takes a break from the homophobia and anti-Semitism and goes to good old-fashioned racism, Lewis. And what a time to do it. And when I say it takes a break from the homophobia, only slightly. There's always still a touch of homophobia, and that's no exception today. Let's take a listen to this week's Hatriot Mail.
David Pakman, you're an idiot and you should shut up or deal with reality. Get the facts and off your race soapbox. Why don't you go and live in a black neighborhood and then you can talk? Right now, you are an uneducated idiot. Black people are dangerous.
What is there to even respond to in this Hatriot Mail, Lewis? Sometimes we must present without comment for the audience to make of it what they will.
Yeah, it's, Dave, it's just some good old-fashioned racism, fear-mongering, and patriotism.
And what better than having Hatriot Mail every single day in 2016? Get that 2016 Hatriot Mail calendar, davidpakman.com/calendar16. The Hatriots, Lewis, are not happy that the Hatriot Mail calendars are doing so well.
Well, they should be, because it's their quotes that that make it all possible. And so, Dave, it's a symbiotic relationship. They need to know that.
It is indeed. No question about that. davidpakman.com/calendar16. Next week, more Hatriot Mail, and it won't be less crazy. Let me put it that way. It hasn't been a very good few days for Ted Cruz since the Planned Parenthood terrorist attack, where 3 people, including a police officer, were killed by a white, American-born, anti-Obama, anti-abortion terrorist. And Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz was one of the first people who spoke out of the presidential candidates after that terrorist attack at Planned Parenthood. He said he was, quote, praying for the loved ones of those killed, those injured, and first responders who bravely got the situation under control in Colorado Springs. In a campaign event on Sunday, he actually called the murders horrific and wrong. Well, that all sounds pretty good, right? Except that it has now been revealed that shortly before the shootings, none other than our buddy Ted Cruz promoted the endorsement of an activist who has called for the execution of abortion providers. We have a link on the YouTube video for this clip from Ted Cruz's own website touting the endorsement of Troy Newman. If the Ted Cruz campaign hasn't figured out they're going to want to scrub that. They may have removed it by now, right?
Yeah, I would hope so. It's been there's been some outrage.
In his book, Their Blood Cries Out, Troy Newman wrote the following. Let's take a look at this quote. In addition to our personal guilt in abortion, the United States government has abrogated its responsibility to properly deal with the blood guilty. This responsibility rightly involves executing convicted murderers, including abortionists, for their crimes in order to expunge blood guilt from the land and people. Instead, the act of abortion has been elevated to a God-given right, and the abortionists canonized as saints. Consequently, the entire nation has the blood-red stain of the lives of the innocent upon its head. That is from Troy Newman's book, Their Blood Cries Out. Now, Newman is kind of backtracking, saying that listen, that entire book was just a theological study. His writing was not actually advocating of any violence. Yeah, when people actually do what you suggest, you say, oh, that's not at all what I was suggesting. But we know it's BS. And you know how we know it's BS? Because if Troy Newman was really against the murder of abortionists, he wouldn't have put out a press release in 2003 where he criticized the conviction of Paul Hill for murdering an abortion doctor. Paul Hill murdered a Florida abortion doctor, was convicted, and Troy Newman argued in a press release that, quote, there was no justice because the court prevented him from presenting the legal defense that his conduct was justifiable defensive action. So according to Newman, Lewis, it shouldn't be a crime to kill an abortion doctor because the abortion doctor is killing the fetus, and thus killing an abortion doctor is self-defense of a third person. That's the argument from the guy who now is backtracking, saying, listen, I'm not really talking about killing abortionists.
Yeah, that's the problem with religious texts and people's interpretation of them. It's pretty easy to go back and say, that's not really what I was talking about.
Right.
You could look at it this way, you could look at it that way. But if you're saying stupid things and throwing this stuff out there, people are going to listen to it. People are going to draw their own conclusions.
Right.
And if those people own guns, well, I suppose bad things can happen.
And don't forget that the same Republicans who claim to be mourning the victims of the Planned Parenthood terrorist attack are the same Republicans who were promoting fake videos about Planned Parenthood allegedly selling baby parts or saying we need to stop abortion by any means necessary. And now we're supposed to believe they're actually the good guys. And lastly, I'll remind you that this is the same Ted Cruz who stood on stage in support of a pastor named Kevin Swanson who advocates the killing of all homosexuals. So this is not at all an outlier with regard to Ted Cruz. Now, it gets worse for Ted Cruz. In the wake of the Planned Parenthood white anti-abortion, anti-Obama terrorist attacks, Republican Senator and presidential candidate Ted Cruz is accusing news outlets of covering up what he calls violent tendencies among Democrats. Let's listen to him explain that most violent crime is committed by Democrats. Now, listen for the source. Let's take a listen.
And before I switch to the 2016 race, I have been doing pro-life events for 25 years. I've probably done more than 100 of them. Sure. I have never met, not once, a single pro-life activist who is in favor of violence of any sort. Have you,
Troy
Senator
Newman.
Cruz?
I have not. And I would note that this whole episode has really displayed the ugly underbelly of the media. Every time you have some sort of violent crime or mass killing, you can almost see the media salivating, hoping desperately that the murderer happens to be a Republican so they can use it to try to paint their political enemies. Now, listen, here's the simple and undeniable fact. The overwhelming majority of violent criminals are Democrats. The media doesn't report that.
Right.
What they report, and there's a reason why the Democrats for years have been viewed as soft on crime, because they go in and they appoint to the bench judges who release violent.
Okay. If you were waiting for Ted Cruz to cite his source, I hope you weren't holding your breath, because he doesn't, because there is no data to suggest that most violent criminals are Democrats. Hugh Hewitt, the host, failed to mention that Ted Cruz has embraced the support of Kevin Swanson, a pastor who has called for the putting to death of all gay people. Cruz has previously accused the man behind the fatal shooting at Planned Parenthood, Robert Louis Deere, as being a transgendered leftist activist. That has completely been debunked. He was not transgender. He also was a right-winger. There is really nothing to debunk because Ted Cruz cites no data, no studies, nothing. What can we say, though, Lewis, about which political policies are responsible for more crime? It's pretty clear. Raising the minimum wage reduces crime. We know crime is driven many times by one's economic situation. Republicans are against raising the minimum wage. Increased income and wealth inequality, increased crime by creating this unbridgeable gap between the haves and the have-nots. Republicans are not the party interested in reducing that gap. That certainly doesn't decrease crime. And social welfare programs generally reduce the desperation to steal or commit petty crime. That's the truth.
Well, you could make those arguments. Ted Cruz might just say, this is about personal responsibility.
Right.
Regardless of your situation, nobody should be committing any type of violent or petty crime. And so, he can make that argument, but he's really not trying to make life better or easier for Americans.
Oh, Ted Cruz, are you crazy? If anything, Ted Cruz is making life worse for a plurality of people, in spite of the fact that he doesn't want any policies that would be bad for grandma because his mom is on Social Security. That's sort of like his plea. That's Ted Cruz being a sympathetic guy, where he says, hey, I might say completely crazy stuff about just about every political issue, but I won't do anything that's bad for grandma because my mom is alive and I care about her.
Yeah, but as soon as his mom isn't, Dave, you can count on entitlements are out the window.
After the break, what predictions about climate change should we take seriously, and which predictions might be hyperbolic or exaggerated? We are going to drill down on that with Dr. Michael Mann right after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Michael Mann is Distinguished Professor and Director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State University and also author of 2 books, including Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, and The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. It's so great to have you on, and the book really presents in sort of ordinary, straightforward language the important findings of what is currently happening with the climate crisis on Earth. I would love to start at the broadest point possible with regard to what predictions we can make and predictions people may have heard about the future of the climate crisis. People sometimes hear, oh, the entire East Coast will be underwater, or all of the ice will be melted and the polar ice caps, etc. And sometimes it sounds a little bit hyperbolic. So let's break it down. What are the real concerns with regard to what we can predict will happen as a result of continued climate change?
Thanks. It's good to be on the show with you. So if we continue with business as usual, burning of fossil fuels, if we don't take precautionary actions to deal with our increased ongoing emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, we will likely see between 7 and 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the globe by the end of the century. Now, that won't, that doesn't mean that the entire U.S. will be submerged below the ocean. It means that there will likely be enough sea level rise to force us essentially to retreat from many of the major coastal cities of the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. It will mean that many of the problems we are already seeing, damaging impacts of climate change related increases in extreme weather, wildfires, droughts, flooding, all those things that we have seen already, worsened weather events because of the impact of climate change, will get that much worse. If we, again, continue with business as usual burning of fossil fuels by the end of the century and we warm the planet by 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, arguably the rates of change that we will see in our climate will exceed our ability to adapt to those changes. On the other hand,
I'm curious, Michael, as far as the temperature change, you talked about the sea level rise that we would see. If our oceans were warmer also, would that not have a significant impact on ocean life and thus the entire animal ecosystem?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, right now we have a major El Nino event going on, and it sort of gives us a glimpse of the future because during El Ninos, often sea surface temperatures are around the world are much warmer than they would normally be. And with those large El Nino events, like the one we're seeing right now, we often see massive die-off of corals. We see an event called coral bleaching, where corals, they lose their color because the symbiotic organisms that give them that color literally flee. But the corals can't move. They're stuck. And if that goes on long enough, that kills off the corals. That is combined with the effects of ocean acidification. As we increase CO2 in the atmosphere, the oceans become more acidic. So all of these things are impacting ocean biota, coral reefs. This is part of the reason that climate change represents a major threat to ocean biodiversity, to fish populations, and our ability to continue to feed ourselves through fishing.
I would love to hear a little bit from you about how our audience can tackle when they are on the receiving end of what to me sounds like a tired old talking point from so-called climate skeptics or non-science believers, as I like to call them, that, hey, listen, humans on Earth, we only have observations about temperature from a very tiny slice of the history of our planet. And there's really no way at all to say that the changes in temperature we're seeing today are any more than just cyclical temperature changes. We've had ice ages, and it logically follows we also have warmer periods. We only have a little bit of data. That's a very common talking point we hear from climate skeptics. What can our audience have sort of in their arsenal to refute that?
Sure. So I will respond to that particular talking point, but it's often very useful to draw upon resources that exist out there. There is a site called skepticalscience.com, and if you go to that website, they have a list of the 100 or so leading climate change denier talking points, and the scientific responses to each of those talking points at the introductory, intermediate, and advanced level.
Fantastic.
And even better than that, you can download the whole thing onto your smartphone and have it at your fingertips. So, you know, at that Thanksgiving dinner where that cantankerous uncle that you have who always comes armed with, you know, you've got that at your disposal and you can respond to him in real time. But with that particular talking point, it's actually combining a number of myths. First of all, it wouldn't even matter if the current warmth that we've seen, whether or not it's unprecedented, the reason for past periods of warmth is understood. The reason that you know, the temperatures were so warm during the early Cretaceous period when dinosaurs roamed the planet, that was because of very high CO2 levels, a very high greenhouse effect. And that happened naturally over tens of millions of years due to natural variations in the concentrations of these greenhouse gases that have to do with things like plate tectonics. So those changes happen over a time scale of, you know, it's 100 million years if you go back to the early Cretaceous period. What we are doing by burning fossil fuels is literally taking all the carbon that got buried in the ground after that period over 100 million years, and we're putting it back up into the atmosphere, but over a time scale of 100 years, 1,000,000 times faster. So it's the rate at which we are modifying the atmosphere and warming the planet that is cause for concern, not whether or not there might have been past periods in the distant past that were as warm. One other thing, we do know that the recent warming spike is unprecedented, going back into the last ice age and probably back more than 100,000 years. There are various lines of paleoclimate evidence that we can use to piece together the puzzle of how the climate changed in the past. And those data tell us that the recent warming spike is likely unprecedented in tens of thousands of years, maybe more than 100,000 years. So it is unusual. And the CO2 concentrations that we've reached already are higher than they've been in millions of years. We know that as well.
And Michael, how drastic do human activities on Earth have to change to really make a dent in the impact that we're having? You know, sometimes I'll read about a new initiative. For example, we could move 30% of New York State's electricity consumption to renewable and green alternative energies on a per capita basis. And I'm thinking per capita, our population continues to increase. We're talking only about 30%. It seems like 10 years from now, any benefit that we get from doing that is already going to be undone by our population growth. Is my sort of pessimism or feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we have on our hands here justified, or can we really make a dent in this?
Yeah, I think it's a little overly pessimistic. Population in the U.S. isn't climbing. It's population in developing nations that continues to climb. But when demographers look at sort of the large-scale trends right now with global population, they estimate that we'll probably plateau by the middle of this century at about 9 billion people. So yes, there will be more people. Right now there are about 7 billion people, but that's not going to continue on an exponential trajectory like it has in the past. It appears to be plateauing out. Now, can we provide energy for those people without the continued burning of fossil fuels? That's the real challenge. And you mentioned the possibility of New York generating 30% of its electricity from renewables. Well, Germany's already doing it. Germany is doing that. If you look around the globe, if you tally the total global electricity use, we are now up to about 22% of our electricity generation globally coming from renewables. So there has been a dramatic turning of the corner just over the past few years in moving away from burning of fossil fuels, moving towards renewable energy to generate electricity. We've got a lot farther to go, but last year, for the first time ever, or the first time in many decades, we saw global economic growth without any growth in carbon emissions.
Right, and we reported on
scientist-
that extensively, and that seems to be a really
Yeah.
important indicator of where things could go with the right decisions made, is it not?
Absolutely. It suggests that we're turning the corner. Now, we're not yet turning the corner fast enough to stabilize those greenhouse gas concentrations below dangerous levels. So it's going to take a lot more work, but there's reason for cautious optimism. We are already beginning to turn the corner.
Well, any conversation about climate change where my view is unnecessarily pessimistic, for me is a win. You know, I mean, that's good news for sure. I'll remind our audience we've been speaking with Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor and Director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University. Check out his book, Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Adams County State Representative in Colorado, Joanne Windholtz, is blaming not the shooter, but rather Planned Parenthood for the November 27th terrorist attack at that Colorado Planned Parenthood clinic. That attack, of course, left 3 dead and 9 injured. This woman, Representative Joanne Windholtz, is one of the few Colorado Republicans that have issued a statement at all. And if this is any indication as to why they're keeping quiet, I think keeping quiet is the right move, because this statement is an utter abortion. Sorry for the necessary term there. Let's take a look at this quote, Lewis, from Ms. Windholtz. She said, "Violence is never the answer, but," and it's already extraordinary, right? Violence is never the answer, but we must start pointing out who is the real culprit. The true instigator of this violence, and all violence at any Planned Parenthood facility, is Planned Parenthood themselves. Violence begets violence. So Planned Parenthood, you stop the violence inside your walls. Windholtz referenced the Center for Medical Progress video that alleged Planned Parenthood and the Colorado Springs Clinic were trafficking in baby body parts. And this is just the parroting of the same nonsense that caused the shooting in the first place, right? She's saying Planned Parenthood is responsible for the violence, including all of those baby part sales, which were cited by the shooter, right? She is actually the one who, in blaming Planned Parenthood for the shooting, is doing exactly what actually may have partially caused the shooting in the first place.
Yeah, so you have a situation where it's quite possible that irresponsible media coverage around Planned Parenthood was the cause of the shooting. Do we believe that if that never happened, or if Planned Parenthood was not making headlines at all, if Planned Parenthood didn't do abortions at all, would this guy just be sitting at home watching 30 Rock, or would this guy instead be shooting up, I don't know, some Democratic campaign office or something like that? I mean,
yeah.
How do you really know, you know?
And let's understand what her argument is. Her argument is based entirely on the religious view that abortion is murder. This is not based on any medical reality. This is not based on any scientific reality. And once you go down the path of saying of basing your opinion merely on the views of your self-professed and arbitrary particular religion, it starts to become acceptable to say that Planned Parenthood is responsible here because it's based on your religious beliefs. You can't really talk sense into someone like that.
No, and she is failing to mention that the things happening at Planned Parenthood and other abortion clinics is legal, right?
Abortion is legal. Planned Parenthood has done nothing illegal. Planned Parenthood reduces the number of abortions by providing birth control and sex education, etc. The Christian abstinence-only promoters like Miss Windholtz actually are leading to more unintended pregnancy, which increases the number of abortions. Good luck explaining that to Ms. Windholtz. You're not going to get very far with that explanation. Let's talk about something that I'm curious what the audience reaction is going to be. We've talked about the double standard that is applied to Jews and Israel that I've been talking about for years. This is a double standard that has existed for a very long time. We do our best to point it out. Here's a horrible example. A retired Cambridge academic named Dr. Marsha Levine spent 10 years at the University of Cambridge's MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research. She is an expert on ancient horses and all sorts of horse-related stuff. She is being accused of outrageous and utterly unacceptable behavior. What did she do? A 13-year-old Israeli girl came to her for help with a school project. Dr. Levine refused to help the 13-year-old on the basis that she is Israeli, quote, until there is peace in Palestine. Was the 13-year-old girl's project at all related to Israel or to Palestine? No. The girl's project was about ancient horses, and Dr. Levine told Shahar Rabinovich that she won't answer any of the girl's questions because she boycotts Israel. The 13-year-old, Shahar Rabinovich, had emailed Dr. Levine, who's an expert in the origins and evolution of horse husbandry, explaining, I know you are a very important person, and I've read your articles about horses. And she went on to send another email asking about how ancient horses lived and whether humans preserved ancient breeds of horses, blah, 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 etc. And Dr. Levine, an academic, told the schoolgirl, you might be a child, but if you were old enough to write to me, you were old enough to learn about Israeli history and how it has impacted the lives of Palestinian people. Maybe your family has the same views I do, but I doubt it. And Dr. Levine was then contacted by the Telegraph and asked about what exactly happened here. And Dr. Levine said, if a school student from a different country had gotten in touch with her to ask about horses, she would have responded differently. Think about the hypocrisy, Lewis. The Palestinians, the people like Dr. Levine say, the Palestinians were unlucky to maybe have been born in the Gaza Strip, and now they live in these horrible conditions. We don't want to punish the Palestinians for something they have no control over, which is where they are born. Shahar Rabinowitz, at 13 years old, has had no responsibility whatsoever for whatever you may like or dislike about Israeli policy towards Palestinians or to anybody else. And Dr. Levine is punishing Shahar Rabinowitz for something that she has just as much control over as a Palestinian being born in the Gaza Strip, which she says we should not punish Palestinians for. This is atrocious and disgusting, and she considers herself a supporter of the vile and heinous BDS movement. This is just sickening on every level.
Like we even need to explain how absurd and pathetic this is.
Yeah.
And now, there's something is being brought into this, this entire, I don't know what you would call it, exchange between the two.
Yeah.
Dave, I'm trying to think of an example of this. This would be like some, Mexican kid coming up to me on the street and saying, can you tell me where this street is? Like, I lost my parents. I don't know where I am. Can you give me some directions here? And I'm like, I'm not big on Mexicans,
right.
Illegally coming into this country. I'm sorry, kid. I just can't help you.
It's exactly like that, and it is absolutely disgusting. And we're trying to organize a good debate over BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanction thing that exists out there. And we're going to work on that this week, right, Lewis? I mean, that would be a really great debate to have.
Yeah, I'll get right on that.
We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to a voicemail I received this morning.
Hey, David. Hey, Lewis. This is Spencer from Southwest Louisiana, and I just wanted to address the profound question levied at Harris Faulkner by Brian Kilmeanow. I just wanted to say that it sounds to me like what he's saying is that to Harris, I know that you've worked your ass off to get where you are in life. But to me, and to people that think like me, all I'm ever going to see is a silly, ridiculous stereotype. Tell me if you think I'm reaching. It may be
a little bit of a reach, but it is a pretty good thing. This is from the Fox News clip where Black co-host Harris Faulkner went on to show her peach cobbler recipe, and Brian Kilmeade said, "Hey, do you make Kool-Aid?" And it's an interesting idea, right? Professional woman successful journalist, albeit on Fox News, respected, has kids, raising kids, cooking, doing all the normal stuff that anybody would do. But Brian Kilmeade still says, I don't care about all that stuff. I'm still curious whether because you're black, you make Kool-Aid. Interesting thought. Very, very interesting thought. I don't know how accurate it is, but interesting nonetheless. On today's bonus show, my porn star lookalike is now coming under fire. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we will tell you on the bonus show. Also, a New York City's chain restaurant salt rule makes no sense. We'll talk about that. And Saudi Arabia plans to build the world's tallest tower. We will talk about whether we care and whether it's likely we will ever visit it in person. DavidPakman.com/membership. And of course, DavidPakman.com/calendar16. Get the 2016 Hatriot Mail calendar. We will speak to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.